So welcome everyone to this Zoom session, this lunchtime. Thank you for joining us for this catch up of the Faraday Church's community. I'm so pleased to have Nick Spencer and Hannah Waite here, who are both authors involved in this book, Playing God, Science, Religion and the Future of Humanity, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's one of the more expensive SPCK offerings, but I have to reassure you that it's not, well, if it's reassuring, it's not one of the slightly unreadable academic ones. Sorry, I shouldn't say that about SPCK books. They don't do those. But it's a good fun read, and I ripped through it, thoroughly enjoyed it. It updated all sorts of parts of my thinking on a whole range of topics, including AI, medical ethics, living forever, extraterrestrial intelligence, mental health, all sorts of topics that come up in church life. And my opinion is if you want the one book you're going to read about science and religion just to get you started, I think, or to update your knowledge, I think this is the one. So Hannah Waite is a visiting lecturer at the London School of Theology. She's involved in a research project at the University of Aberdeen, trying to help mental health clinicians understand religious practices. She is a research partner of the ECLAS project in Durham and was involved for a number of years as a researcher on this project for which this book was one of the outcomes at the Theos think tank. She did her PhD at the University of Aberdeen on the clinical this lived experience of stigma in Christians with a clinical diagnosis of bipolar disorder. I think, Hannah, with John Swinton, who is who's one of my a regular at the Faraday Institute. So you can check out both Hannah and John's work on this topic, which is incredibly helpful. And Nick Spencer is a senior fellow at the Theos think tank. He's written a number of books, including Magisteria, The Entangled Histories of Science and Religion, which came out with One World in 2023. He has a podcast called Reading Our Times, and a number of other roles in research as a sociologist. So thank you for joining us, both of you, to talk about this excellent new book. First of all, you get an opportunity to add to your own introduction. Did I miss anything out that is very key to who you are?
Not me. You covered me pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I'm Northern Irish, and I feel a wee bit, like I'm representing the Northern Irish clan here. That's probably the only thing. So I apologize for my accent.
Never apologize, Hannah. I keep trying to hold on to my Scottish accent and losing it time to time after being in England for so long. So I'm very, very glad you're here and that you don't have to cross time zones to be with us. So can I start off by asking, what's this book for? I've said I'm recommending to church leaders, but why did you write it? What was it for? Either of you, just jump in.
Well, I can kick off with that. It's the product of a 3-year research project we conducted in partnership with Faraday Institute, funded by one of the Templeton charities, looking at science, religion. There are a number of publications, lots of research that went into that, and there's a kind of a big, heavy sort of academic book coming out next year. But this is the lighter, frothier one, if I can put it that way. And this kind of takes, as you said in your introduction, a number of topics that people will be reading about or scrolling through their feeds or listening to pretty much daily, if not weekly, and then explores how are these science and religion topics, and in particular, how can science and religion engage fruitfully in the discussion of them.
So would you agree with that, Hannah? Who was in your head as you were doing your work on this book you were aiming for?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I would also say that I really liked your point with that it's an introduction. If you're wanting to kind of get to terms with what's going on in science and religion in the contemporary world or in our societies at the moment, this is a really good introduction. I think one of the things that Nick and I found the most throughout that 3-year research project was that the ideas or the things that we think about science and religion to do with like the Big Bang theory or cosmology or anything like that, we think that they're the big arguments, but that's not where the general public are actually interested in. So this book deals more with subject matters that people who aren't necessarily interested in thinking about the history of science and religion would actually be interested in, and that they're confronted with, like the likes of thinking about AI, vaccinations, how to live past maybe what your body wants you to live, and how to live forever and things like that. So I think it's a good introduction, but it also deals with topics in a way and yeah, that people kind of don't think of as science and religion at times, if that helps.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that out, Hannah, and that was something I quoted in my own review, that this is about topics that real people outside the I was going to say real people, but people outside the academic world will be interested in engage with. So that's another reason why I'm going to be recommending it. So, and Hannah, can we stay with you and ask you, what's your I know you're supposed to like all the chapters equally because it's your book, but which one did you really enjoy working on? What and why?
Yeah, so two of them would probably be there's a chapter on mental health talking about a scientific cure for sadness, and just because my background's in psychology and theology, that idea of trying to think about how we use science as a way to think about sadness or the human condition, human emotions, and trying to, at times, I suppose we can medicate, trying to just think about that. Not that medication's bad, but trying to think about it in a fuller, more holistic way. And the other chapter I really enjoyed was thinking through the chapter about living forever. Well, I'm trying to think of exactly what we called it, Nick. I know the chapter's how not to live forever, but
Scientific immortality.
Scientific immortality. So we had done a large public opinion survey with YouGov where we had 5,000 participants, and Nick and I just thought it would be fun to add some really interesting kind of out there questions where we asked people, would they be willing to be cryogenically frozen? Would they want to kind of use science to live forever? And it was actually through that research piece that I believe that Nick and I started to think a bit more about this topic, about how people like, oh my gosh, what is his name? You all know who I mean. Nick, he's in the States. He's done quite a few documentaries and he's trying to engineer living forever. He's like 60, but his body age is like 50 or something.
Not Ray Kurzweil. I mean, there's a number of them who are into this scientific immortality.
I can't remember who it is, but I think that's awful, isn't it? I should remember people's names. But I think that was something I found that was really, really interesting, and thinking through that and why people would be open to living forever scientifically was, yeah, it was an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I was fascinated by how many people didn't want to live forever, and I thought there seemed to be a degree of, in my humble opinion, wisdom out there, people who are like, no, that would be awful. And also just on the remembering names thing is a good reminder to our audience that science moves on so rapidly. I mean, for the average researcher who will work on this kind of book, by the time it goes to press, they're already on the next project and into the next thing. I think it's a fantastic illustration of just how quickly these kinds of fields move. That by the time the book's out, in a good way, it's already slightly out of date. So I presume in your interviews, you're doing quite a lot of, and the recent thing is, this, and I think that's just the way this field works and why we keep needing these publications on this. And what about you, Nick? What was your favorite chapter to work on?
Well, they're all good fun. But I'd pick up two. One was the movement to recognise the personhood of animals. We might come to talk about that a bit later on in our discussion, but the Non-Human Rights Project has been campaigning vociferously in the US and in a few other places to get the personhood of certainly intelligent primates, some elephants, dolphins to be recognised legally, and that kicks up lots of questions of what personhood is, not just in a legal sense, but in a metaphysical sense as well. But also you can't not enjoy writing about aliens, and the second chapter is there anybody out there, which begins with a relatively kind of sound calculation that 100 billion stars in our galaxy, 100 billion galaxies. Now we have no idea how likely life is, but we do know that life evolved on this planet, our planet, relatively quickly. Discovery of what's known as exoplanets, so these are planets orbiting stars and other solar systems, is just moving apace. There's something like 5,000 or 6,000 of them recognized now. In other words, there are a vast number of planets in the universe. The odds are that somewhere or other life has evolved elsewhere. One of our interviewees rated it as about one per galaxy, which would be a nice kind of round number. But either way, if life is omnipresent in the universe, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for a religious belief system that seems to think human beings are in some way unique, or maybe even uniquely rational? And what would we do if we made contact with them? I wouldn't put money on that one in particular, but it's great speculation, because no one's ever really going to prove you wrong. And yet it works a kind of intellectual laboratory where you can test out ideas.
Yeah. Interesting. Having thought of, already mentioned, fields moving on rapidly, which do you think, I mean, either of you can jump in here, which of these chapters do you think will become out of date as the most quickly? I don't mean is it out of date now, but where do you think the fields are moving on rapidly in a very exciting way?
Well, I'll jump in there. We did comment in the preface. We left a 2-page gap right at the beginning of the book to put a preface in which we mentioned some of the news stories that had come out in the gap of time between us submitting the manuscript and it going to publication. And we mentioned the point that, the one sort of chapter that would be kind of radically rewritten, or at least have some kind of firmer conclusions to it, would be the alien chapter if we did make contact with alien life. And in particular, we jokingly say that if we made contact with alien life that signed off its transmission to us with a reference to the Holy Trinity, it would clear up a whole load of questions. And indeed, that is exactly what happened in an episode of The Simpsons, for anyone who's a fan of The Simpsons. Slightly more realistically or more seriously, it's AI is the field that's moving on most rapidly, at least if you were to measure it by kind of news headings. As it happens, I don't think the underlying questions are changing there. But I guess, for my money, the chapter on AI and also the chapter on genetic engineering are the ones most amenable to falsification, if I can put it that way. So if we stumble upon something that or indeed verification, I guess, if we stumble upon something that is radically changed in our development of AI, or our capacity to change the human phenotype, I think those chapters are kind of most at risk of being out of date in that way.
Interesting. What about you, Hannah?
Yeah, I think Nick's hit the nail on the head there. Definitely with AI, I'm even thinking of whenever we started thinking about the idea of AI becoming human, or being ascribed personhood, or the role of AI moving on, was before ChatGPT became as popular as it was. So even if I'm thinking about when we first started to talk about this chapter, or to talk about this in the research, that was before we started to use ChatGPT. And I'm guilty of using ChatGPT. I'm going to Sicily in 2 weeks, and I'm like, where to go in Sicily for the first time? Plan me a road trip. And even thinking of how quickly ChatGPT just has even became ingrained into people's lives. Like, even the amount of academics I've spoken to are like, just ask ChatGPT to write you like an introduction or a essay structure or something. I find really interesting. I'm not going to name any academics, obviously, because we're all very, prim and proper, and computer and technology does not help us with our thoughts at all.
The fact we wrote the book before ChatGPT came out, you can guarantee its authenticity, okay?
Exactly.
Yes, excellent. And having talked about where fields are moving on fast, I presume a lot of the core ideas have not changed for 100 years. You know, what does it mean to be in the image of God? What is our understanding of personhood? How do we value an unborn child? You know, a lot of the stuff, you know, what you're giving is the latest in the field about things that have concerned humankind for millennia. And having produced my own work on this about 15 years ago, I still happily show it, because although the science has slightly moved on, you know, it's you know, the core ideas are incredibly helpful. And I think that's one of the things that this book really captured very well, is helping us to think about what it means to be human.
We write at one point, science is focusing the spotlight with ever greater intensity on ideas of human uniqueness, freedom, personhood, communication, the body, agency, autonomy, dependence, and perfection. As you say, these have been concepts of moral philosophy and theology for hundreds, arguably thousands of years. In actual fact, the premise of the book is that they're going to become more important as we move into the 21st century, because the human ability to understand, manipulate, and quote unquote improve the human condition is unprecedented at the moment. And they are fundamentally teleological questions. They're questions around what ends, what are you doing this for, what is the goal you're trying to achieve. There's a little bit, and one of the chapters in the book where we go back to Francis Bacon, whom I talk about in my history of science, religion, magisteria, and how he was so hugely influential for the formation of natural philosophy, or experimental natural philosophy as it was in the 17th century, because he explicitly argued that scientists, to use an anachronistic term, natural philosophers, should bracket out teleological questions. Up at the time, Aristotle was still dominant in the scientific world. Aristotelian physics delineated 4 different causes. One of them was a teleological cause, the ends to which things are drawn. And Bacon argued that if you're going to do proper science, you should only be really interested in material and efficient causes. You shouldn't be interested in end causes. So science became successful specifically by bracketing out end causes. Well, scroll forward 400 years, and we're in a situation where at least not much the methodology of science, but the results of science and the abilities of science are now bringing us 4 square up against the question of ends. What are we doing this for? Now, that's always been the case. You know, if you're doing nuclear research in the 1930s and 40s, there's an important teleological question there. But now we have this directly with regards to the human being. What is a human being for? How are human beings different, or are they not different from animals or from, you know, putative aliens? And that really brings the whole scientific enterprise firmly onto what we would call religious territory. Hence, it could be a great opportunity for fruitful dialogue between science and religion if we handle it right.
Yeah, yes, yes. And I think this is where I think, you know, a book like this could be, because it does pose those questions at the end of each chapter, about who we are and what these fields say about who we are, that I think everyone has something to say about, and everyone has experience of. And that was interesting, if you could, because Hannah, I know this was part of your research, a lot of the chapters draw on the data from a project where you were surveying the general public, and also various people in leadership positions. Do you want to just briefly explain that, Hannah, if that?
Yeah, so this book doesn't draw as much on the qualitative component of the research, but in the qualitative component, we interviewed 101, wasn't it, Nick, leading academics who were either scientists or were involved in theology. We interviewed people in the media as well. I don't know, their names are on one of our Theos reports. You can see through who everyone was, but people who have very opposing views, and the majority of which are not religious, which actually made it more interesting, arguably, because they didn't just agree with what Nick and I thought, or thought we thought at the time. And then the second part, which is what we talk about or lean more on in this book, is this large public opinion survey that we developed with YouGov, which has, I think it was like 230 questions about the landscape of science and religion that was asked of a representative sample of the UK. So yeah, it's things from that study, or I suppose that big quantitative survey, that helped us to guide where we would start to put the outputs and start to focus in on, because obviously you've got all of the data from the qualitative research when you're talking to experts, but then when you're looking at what the general public think and the types of questions that we asked, it was easier to pinpoint areas in which, okay, this is actually what could be really important when we're thinking about, the society and general public at large. And those types of questions that I jokingly said earlier were a bit off the wall, but they were important for Nick and I to ask, were things like, do you think that robots will one day be afforded a soul or could have a soul? There's another one about, would you get into a self-driving car? Because how much then do you trust science if you trust the algorithm of a self-driving car? How much do you trust science, to a degree trust, or how comfortable would you do for a robot to perform surgery on you over a human? So there were questions like that, and in that then you're getting at that idea of how much authority and trust do some people place in science, and how much actually is human connection really important. And especially whenever we're thinking about, some people wanting maybe to be a robot to perform surgery on them, like the amount of people who, I can't remember the exact percentages, but the amount of people who were for that wasn't exponentially high. But it also makes you think, well, why would you be for that? How can robots make those close call decisions that a human can make? And yeah, I think that it actually showed us that human connection is more important than sometimes what society can lead us to believe.
Yeah, very important. And I have to recommend, I know where the reports are on the Faraday website. So if you go to the research section and then look at there's a link for the collaborative project that we did with Theos on this. You will find it there. I'm sure you will also find it on the Theos website, where there is a lot of other fascinating information and the link to Nick's podcast, as well as many other things. So do explore both of those. Now, I should say to our audience, you can put questions in the chat box if you have any. I have one more question that I want to ask. I think particularly Nick, I think this is more your focus. As a biologist, I read the chapter on personhood, where and language, and I thought, I think it was the optimist in me that as a biologist, I tend to think of things as, and particularly the history of the field of looking at animal behavior and things that people have. I was listening to a podcast the other night where they were saying the idea of ascribing personality to animals in the in the 70s would have been ridiculous, but now it's just normal. So I did wonder, when this chapter came down on saying, language, and language that, now you can correct me if I'm not describing this properly, language that talks about the future and certain kinds of quite sophisticated ideas and senses of self and other people's self is what sets us apart as human. And I raised my one eyebrow that was optimistic on the part of biology, thinking, really? So I just wondered, Nick, if you could talk a little bit more about this and why you came down on that kind of idea in that chapter.
So that chapter is about animal personhood and whether animals could legally qualify as persons. And as I mentioned earlier, that question is really predicated on whether they are metaphysically persons. When this has come before the courts in America, they've tended to say, look, important question, but isn't a legal question. We can't decide it. The question then becomes, what's a person? And that's not straightforward to answer. And there are different concepts of personhood. And very generally speaking, they fall into two. One is a capacities concept. So a person is recognized by certain capacities they have, whether that's rationality or memory or sometimes emotion, so on and so forth. Another second is which has its roots in Christian thought, which is a more relational concept of personhood. It's not so much what abilities you have, but the way in which you are in a relationship with other persons. Obviously, it's important to have certain capacities to be in relationship, but they're not exactly the same thing. Much of the time in wider discourse, it's around capacities. And this is where the shift, you've rightly pointed out, that there's been a significant shift in the last 50 years or so. So when B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists were running to show the idea that animals had emotions and cognition and reflection and so on and so forth, empathy and that kind of thing, was really laughed out of town because that was considered to be rather kind of Bambi sort of anthropomorphizing, really. It was a strange throwback to Cartesian thought in the 17th century, which argued that, you know, animals were machines effectively, and, you know, if they made a noise, you know, if you kicked your dog, was the famous kind of illustration, it wasn't because the dog felt anything. It was in exactly the same way as an organ made a noise if you pressed a certain button on it. And these ideas kind of go round and round. Interestingly, in the 19th century, they shifted somewhat, and Darwin published a book called The Expression of Emotion in Animals and Man, I think it's called, which, as its title suggests, was very heavily predicated on the idea that animals do feel emotions. Interestingly, it was the only one of his books, I subsequently discovered, that went out of print. And that's because that particular idea went out of print. But the landscape has shifted enormously in the last 50 years or so, and we draw a lot in the book by on a now sadly deceased, he only died recently, Dutch primatologist called Frans de Waal, who I think is a brilliant writer and fascinating on so many of these areas. And a number of books shows in, you know, very convincing details that not only are animals intelligent, particularly New Caledonian crows, corvids are very, very bright, but also, fascinatingly, cephalopods, octopuses, despite the fact they diverged, or we diverged from them 600 million years ago, show real signs of mind, as of course do chimpanzees and bonobos and animals like elephants as well. So there's real signs of cognition there, but also of emotion, of possible foresight, of feeling, and even one might argue of moral reflection, although one has to be slightly careful how you phrase that. None of this means that animals are nice, they're good in the sense, but it just means they operate in the same kind of morals cognitive sphere as we do. So then why not give them personhood? And if that is your definition of personhood, maybe you should. It gives you a whole load of other questions, such as what do you do? How do you divide which animals are have sufficient capacities to have their personhood recognized? But if you go down that avenue, you could argue that animals are persons. But we argue from a Christian theological point of view, the relational concept is more important. And to cut a long argument shorter from the chapter, the relational concept of personhood is very strongly connected to communication, to holding things in common with one another, and to recognize the cognitive and empathic states of other organisms. And for that, we argue language, not just communication. All animals communicate, non-animals communicate, but language, symbolic, abstracted communication, such as human beings are particularly good at, is essential. And Frans de Waal says at one point in one of his books, you won't often hear me say something like this, but I consider us to be the only linguistic species. Again, emphasizing not the only species that communicate, self-evidently not, but the only linguistic species in the sense that we attain a certain level of abstract communication. Now, if, admittedly it's a big if, your idea of personhood is predicated on that idea of communication, that kind of linguistic communication, and everything that opens up for us, the imaginative, empathic, relational universe that opens up for us, the creative universe that opens up for us, that would mean that humans would be persons in the way that animals aren't. I can hold to that view personally because there's a few bits in the chapter when we talk about the way in which speech is absolutely central in Christian theology. God speaks the world into existence in Genesis 1. Humans are required to name species in Genesis 2 in a way that is a creative act. And fascinatingly, in the New Testament, the new Adam, Jesus, heals and brings order to creation through speech. It's one of the things that people most recognize about him. He speaks with authority, not just in teaching, but what he can do. There were lots of miracle workers and wonder workers in the ancient world, but they tended to use stuff in order to get their job done. Jesus speaks new realities into existence, such as when a classic speech act, he forgives sins. So if that speech, if that communication is central to the imaginative, creative, communicative love that is the centre of personhood, then by that argument, humans are persons and non-human animals are not. Doesn't mean you can do anything you like with them. Absolutely not. But it's just an argument for what qualifies as a person and what doesn't.
Interesting. Thank you, Nick. So would you say that is, you're merging the capacity and relational aspects of the definition of personhood together? You're drawing on both of them.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, because I mean, you could make the argument that it would be impossible for a particular species to have that relational concept of personhood unless they had certain capacity that enabled them to have that relational concept of personhood. So the two certainly aren't totally divorced from one another. But I think that I guess the way we describe it in the chapter is that it is not as if speech is simply another capacity like rationality, for example, that you can just tick off the list. It is almost as if speech is like an entranceway. It's a doorway through which, if you have that capacity, you enter into an entirely new, fresh, creative and imaginative and communicative world. And I think that is the distinction. I would put a very important caveat here, though. So you mentioned Reading Our Times, the podcast I run. In this series, we're doing a series of discussions with authors who've written books on the topics that Hannah and I talk about in this book. With an American philosopher called Mark Rowlands, who wrote a book called Can Animals Be Persons? And his argument is no. His argument is yes, yes, they can. And when I was having a kind of discussion with him about this, he was saying, well, the point is, you kind of define your terms and then get the result you expect. So if you define your terms, personhood requires speech. By definition, therefore, non-human animals aren't going to be persons. So he's not convinced with my point of view. And I do recognize you have to come from a certain, in our situation, theologically inflected place to arrive at the conclusions we do.
And I presume another caveat is if I lose the ability to speak, I don't lose my personhood.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's really important to emphasize that we are having this discussion in a normative sense rather than the descriptive sense, by which I mean, this is what you expect humans normally to be able to do. So if you have a human being that can't talk, you would say there is something wrong with them, in that you would expect them to be able to talk in normal run of circumstances, but for whatever reasons, they might not be able to. You come across a chimpanzee who can't talk, you don't say there's something wrong with the chimpanzee, because you're not expecting them to. And I think that's very important, because otherwise the obvious criticism that's leveled at it is, well, what about severely disabled, cognitively impaired people with dementia, Alzheimer's, so on and so forth? Do they sacrifice their personhood? Absolutely not.
Yes, good. Just needed to get that one in there. So thank you so much. We've delved right into, I think, for me, one of those trickiest areas of the wrapping our heads around in the book. But it is, as I've said, a fantastic introduction to these areas. None of the chapters are terribly long. They all start with some great historical detail and then move on to what's happening modern day life, as has been said, drawing on from information from this survey. So right bang up to date, and then on into leading us into keeping up to date with what's happening in the news. So thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Hannah, just before we finish.
No, just thank you for inviting us along, Ruth.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And go and order your book from SPCK. And it was great to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks. You. Bye.
Bye.